All right, so I'm going to do my best to imitate Dr. Wood here. So we'll see how this goes. Learning objectives. Who cares? So this school, which is not important to know the name of, contained a psych lab. This lab was staffed by a guy named Wilhelm. And Wilhelm basically created two trains of thought for initial psychology. The first was structuralism, and then functionalism, as we're going to talk about here shortly. So another student from the same school had people basically fill out a questionnaire of sorts. And this questionnaire, which he termed as introspection, which I like to think of it as inspection of our emotions, had them basically document how they felt about certain stimuli. These stimuli can be as simple as a smell or how we feel about a flower. And he took this information, our subjective data, so subjective meaning how we feel about something, and he built a structure of the mind. So he mapped out the structure of our mind, and this is what he called structuralism, which isn't very creative, but there you have it. So there were also some few problems with this structuralism, and mainly is any problem you could think of with any type of survey. It's unreliable. You're basically highly reliant on people reporting accurately. And at this time, people weren't very intelligent back then, or they just didn't have much education. So relying on their feedback proves to have things unreliable. So the second early psychological principle is termed functionalism. Now, functionalism looked into how we behave and how our mind processes information, and it investigates how these two properties of humans allow us to survive, adapt, and flourish as a species. So really, to contrast structuralism from functionalism, those proponents of functionalism cared more about how the brain acts, its function, rather than what makes up our mind and what makes up our brain. Whereas structuralists or structuralism is more interested in what puts together our thoughts rather than just simply how we act. So now to get into Freud. Freud basically had three major ideas, and we're going to go through each of these three separately. So Freud's first idea was regarding id, ego, and superego. So basically, if you think of id and superego as complete opposites, id is concerned with pleasure. It's the fight, feed, sex mindset. Whereas superego is the complete opposite. All it cares about is the morals, what's right, do the right thing. That's superego. And those two, they are always at conflict with one another. Whereas ego is there to basically play the referee between the two. They're the ones that keep us from being one extreme or the other. Id is like the bad guy, superego is like the super goody two shoes. Ego allows you to be that nice, balanced, normal individual. So the best kind of example I can think of is lying. So when you're telling a lie, superego would say you should never lie. Id would say do whatever you have to do. If you have to lie to get what you want, then lie. Now ego is the in-between that says white lies are okay. You can lie as long as it doesn't cause any real conflict. So Freud's next theory is regarding the psychological development of children. So he believed that children develop during certain sexual stages of development. So each stage goes along with their age. So the oral stage basically is during birth to 1 year, and this is where all you care about as a child is putting things into your mouth. So you're hungry, you suck your thumb, and you get that satisfaction from putting things in your mouth. So these can have effects on you down the line, such as being overfed can lead to being orally aggressive or dominating in the future, whereas underfed can have other characteristics. And you can kind of see here, I'm not going to read through each of them, but it'll tell you basically how each stage can affect you down the line. In the anal stage that's the potty training, so how you're potty trained can affect you. The one that I found confusing, so I'll explain it a little more in detail, is the phallic stage. So this is where you start to get sexual characteristics and you start getting curiosity. So what they're saying here is that basically this is where you start to look and get your sexual identity. So males will identify with their father. And this was kind of interesting. Basically, they thought that boys would try to compete for their mother's attention. So they would see their father as almost like a competition. So this is where this theory of envy and inferiority can come into play, is because you are competing against the member of your family of the same sex. So the way you are raised in that sense will lead to psychological problems or development in the future. And then the last stage is the genital stage, which is basically from puberty and on. And that's where you could read it here. It's not much else to say about that. And then another Freud theory is with regards to defense mechanisms. So I'm not going to go through each one, but the two that I want to point out are projection and sublimation, because I feel like those can get a little mixed up between the two. So projection involves taking your thoughts and putting them on to another person. So let's say someone you don't like I don't like so-and-so. Instead of you saying that you don't like that person, you could say that you're projecting to say that they don't like you, so you take the onus off yourself of that responsibility of feeling bad for not liking that person. And then sublimation is basically taking an impulse or a feeling such as anger and substituting, so sublimation, substitution of that feeling onto a object. And this object or activity is going to be more socially acceptable. So someone who's angry all the time can take up something more socially acceptable like boxing or working out, etc. So this next psychology classification is called behaviorism. And these are the two major people you think of as B.F. Skinner, which is responsible for operant conditioning, and then Ivan Pavlov, which you mostly just hear of Pavlov's dogs. So try to associate Pavlov dogs, and I think of broken skin, and I'll tell you why here in a second. So operant conditioning is basically where you have a behavior that you want. So every time this person or this animal does a certain behavior, you give them a reward. Now, in the opposite case, whenever there's something that you don't want that person to do, then you cause punishment. So if you don't want this animal to pull a lever, then every time you pull a lever, you have them get shocked or become in pain. So that's where I get the B.F. Skinner broken skin, because they grab the lever and they end up having a painful response to try to decrease that behavior. Now, with Pavlov's dogs is classical conditioning. So this is where you think of dogs. So you see here you have the dog before he was taught. He has food. He gets the, when you think about food, your mouth waters. Now, this neutral stimulus doesn't mean anything to you, right? So what they would do is they would take a dog and they would put food in front of it, and they'd also include this neutral stimulus, or like a sound. I think they used keys is what they really did. They had keys along with the food. So then over time, these dogs, every time they hear keys, they would associate it with food. So if you see here, after the conditioning, as soon as they hear the keys, even without the presence of food, they get the conditioned response. So their mouth starts to water because they're thinking about food although it's not currently present. So in contrast to the previous psychological theorems, this next type of psychology is called humanism. So humanism examined people who were striving in their mental health. And basically they looked at how the people that were striving, what about their lives, what environmental influences allowed them to strive, what allowed to them to have better mental health versus people who did not. This next concept is also pretty simple. It's basically what the word says, cognitive neuroscience. So science being the study of, neuro being neurons in the brain, so the structure of the neurons, how it works, and how that affects cognition. So this is what they're talking about with regards to the cognitive neuroscience. So they studied the neurology of the brain, and they looked at how the cognition is affected based on each aspect of the brain. So, for example, this part of the brain can lead to hope or self-esteem or whatever. That's all they're really saying here. Definitions, all rather self-explanatory. So next we're going to be talking about identifying. So this is just giving a list of 5 different models or paradigms and how we can assess for the cause of mental health. Medical model is basically regular medicine. You're looking for a biological cause of a disease, you make a diagnosis, and then you simply treat that diagnosis. And treatment is some kind of combination of medications or somatic therapies, somatic meaning body, so body therapies such as yoga, for example. So the psychodynamic model is an evolution of Freudian theory. So it says that psychopathology, or diseases of the mind, is a result of unconscious conflicts, meaning the id, the ego, the superego, as well as experiences that we get in childhood. And this is referring to that oral phase, the phallic phase, all those sexual development phases that we experience in childhood, how that affects our mental health in the future. It also is referencing the defense mechanisms, which, if you remember, those are designed to help prevent your own anxiety. So this model uses those principles as a way to treat childhood mental health as well as underlying anxiety. Cognitive behavior model, on the other hand, says that we're born at a blank state. We get a blank check, and then everything that we do from there is a product of learning. So we learn to have good or bad mental health. So this focuses on what we think and learn and how that will lead to changes in our observable behavior. Now, the humanistic model says we are born as naturally good individuals, and it's our society or our environment that changes us from good to not so good. So this last model, the systemic model, says that humans are basically the sum of multiple parts. So the biological, the psychological, the social aspects all come together and lead to who we are. This is basically just displaying how the systemic model comes together, how the social plus the biological plus the psychological influences in our lives affects our behavior or our mental process. So overall, those previous 4 models that we talked to helped us come up with this biopsychosocial approach, or the systemic model. So you got to think holistically in your approach and think about the whole picture, and that'll help you better treat mental health. So this next section, what distinguishes normal behavior from abnormal behavior? And the rest of this stuff is pretty self-explanatory, so you could just read it. Hope it was beneficial. See you guys later.